So thanks for the warm introduction. That's a habit I've picked up. I live in Cambodia. It's become a reflex, but welcome, I suppose, to my living room. It's 8 p.m. here, so I am not in the office, but I'm very grateful to be the opening presentation on the topic of data-driven transit. And while the other presentations will probably go into more technical depth through use cases and case studies, I would like to take the opportunity to speak at a slightly higher level on how to enable and maximize the potential for transit data through governance structures. And I'll be putting a specific emphasis on the need for open data platforms and governance framework from both a systems and service perspective. And by open systems, I'm referring to technology solutions that can integrate, interoperate, and share data with one another, for example, through open APIs. And by open services, I'm referring to governments essentially opening up some or all of their data sets to third parties in order to foster innovation. And I trust this will also nicely set the scene for the two presentations to follow. And some of you may already work in the ITS space and be familiar with frameworks, but I do hope that some elements will be of interest to you, and some of you may not have any awareness of ITS frameworks. So without further ado, let me kickstart the presentation. I'll give a brief note on the transport technology landscape. Then I'll talk about transport or intelligent transport systems, ITS, and then we'll deep dive into ITS governance and the types of frameworks and architectures cities and governments and nations should be looking to develop. And we'll talk about how this can be done. And just a quick introduction to me, Conrad Richardson. I'm currently the International Technical Advisor on the Summer Project, a project across the Asean region, and I am based in Cambodia. And the Summer Project, SMMR, stands for Sustainable Mobility in Metropolitan Regions in ASEAN, and it's an ASEAN-German cooperation project implemented by GFA Consulting Group on behalf of GIZ and the Asean Secretariat. The Asean Secretariat is a structure, I suppose, like the EU with much less authority that covers 10 Southeast Asian countries who cooperate on a number of matters, including transport-related matters. And this is the member states in which we work. It's a really fascinating part of the world. Unfortunately, myself and my team were quite limited in where we can travel to at the moment. But within this project, my team and I were developing institutional capacity across ASEAN at a transnational, at a national, and at a metropolitan level on a wide range of topics related to sustainable mobility and urban governance. And this includes the topic of sustainable urban mobility plans, metropolitan transport executives, so TfL style structures or LTA in Singapore or the RTA in Dubai. We also work on open data and ITS, which is what I will focus on today. And earlier today, I was in a webinar speaking about multimodal interchanges. And these are all big concepts that when brought together can aid cities in becoming more sustainable. And besides just building institutional capacity, we also set up ready to implement pilot projects. In Phnom Penh, for example, as part of a wider project, we trained an AI that plugs into a CCTV camera that can count and categorize local vehicles, which is not uncommon, but in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, this is much easier said than done because the vehicles here are not uniform like you would find in North America, in the Middle East. Here we have motorbikes of all shapes and sizes, pulling trailers of all shapes and sizes. So we have developed solutions locally that can then plug into enterprise solutions, which can be used for different functions. And I'll get into that shortly. And just to end off the summer introduction, the overarching aim of our project is to equip these cities with the know-how, but also, I suppose, the know-what and the know-why of effective urban governance so they can take these concepts forward and develop themselves. And our fundamental goal is of sustainable development, or at least a form of development with far fewer negative externalities. And quickly to touch on my previous work, because I will try to tie this in, I've been very fortunate to work in the transport technology space from various angles. I've worked in a public transport planning capacity in East Africa, in an ITS engineering capacity in the Middle East, and I've also worked for well-established transport software solution developers, as well as startups. And now, more recently, I work in urban governance in Southeast Asia. So on this fairly chaotic journey of mine across many geographies, I've been very fortunate to develop a well-rounded understanding of our industry. And I'm sure many of you agree that it's a very interesting time for us to be in the transport technology space, perhaps the most interesting time in recent decades. And I don't say this just for the developed and technologically mature cities. I know we have guests from all over the world. And I would argue that the technologies being developed today are even more widely applicable in many of the developing and the emerging cities of the world. And I will speak to this throughout my presentation. And just another thought is how in the last decade, or maybe in the last 5 years, or even the last 2 years, we've seen huge innovations in technology, transit included. And this is all thanks to major advancements in computer processing power, cloud computing, algorithmic development, IoT. We have sprinkled our cities with IoT devices and sensors, and we all carry smartphones, which also can double up as a sort of IoT device. And then there's been huge advancements in data, the sharing of data and the availability of data. And I can throw in a lot of other buzzwords like blockchain, mass, connected autonomous vehicles. And these advancements are not being developed in isolation, but many industries are now converging, which is really great. And for the most part, it should be encouraged. But in some instances, and I think you'll all agree, this is somewhat scary, in particular with automation. And what's more scary than automation itself is how unprepared and how unaware most governments are. So much of this technology is being refined and defined behind closed doors to be quickly rolled out with little to no regulation. And a lot of companies are, they roll the technology out and they're too big to fail. But that's really a topic for another time. And in my short career, I've gotten to experience the speed of this innovation firsthand, and I'm sure many of you might have too. I work with a small 10-people startup called Blaze Transit. It's an AI-based software platform that allows transit operators to run on-demand bus services using their existing vehicles. And the solutions they are developing, I would argue, are equally, if not more powerful solutions than what some of the major technology companies are developing, because they are building their solutions from scratch using the latest tools, algorithms, methodologies, open data sets. They benefit from GTFS data that we spoke about earlier. And they're not building on top of years of legacy code and software like many of the bigger companies. And this puts them in a very good position to rapidly scale and customize their solutions to meet their clients' needs. And that really should keep us on our toes, and we should all constantly be co-innovating and collaborating. And one other thought is just the technological nature of these solutions. They are decreasingly infrastructure heavy, yet can have a very big impact on urban operations. If you think of a control center, for example, the core functionality of a control center today can run on a small set of servers and a couple computers instead of a billion-dollar building. And also solutions that are being developed in Europe can relatively easily be tested and deployed in countries like Cambodia, where I am today, which will allow countries and cities in Cambodia to really leapfrog in a very short time frame and become very technologically advanced. So in the case of Phnom Penh, where I'm working, instead of inserting expensive inductive loops into the streetscape to activate or actuate or optimize the traffic signals, what we've been doing here is using CCTV cameras with an algorithm that can effectively count and categorize vehicles, which I mentioned previously. And with that piece of hardware, we can also get plug in ANPR, so get number plate recognition, calculate vehicle speeds. So with one solution and a couple lines of code or different softwares, we can develop a wide range of functionality at a very low cost. So this is all very exciting. And so that was a fairly long introduction, and I'll dive into the presentation now. I will assume that you're all reasonably familiar with ITS and transit data technology. The topic of the webinar does fall under this umbrella of ITS. So if you don't know what ITS is, it's basically IT for transport, where we have hardware and software being fused together to form solutions, and solutions for multimodal transport systems. All forms of transport have various ITS solutions. And by systems, think of them as systems and subsystems. And when these come together, we create ITS solutions. So essentially, ITS systems are technological systems and services that are really designed for optimizing the movement of people and goods. And why do we have these? Well, in the simplest form, the movement of people and goods is increasingly complex. And you could argue that the real world has simply become too complex for individuals to measure and manage without communication and automatic control technology. So ITS is really here to aid and automate our decision-making, and for which we've developed thousands of ITS systems and subsystems that make up a wide variety of transport solutions. And that's kind of where the problem lies. There are so many of these solutions that if you are a government that wants to become more technologically advanced, you need to be able to understand, classify, organize all these different solutions based on their function. And for this, cities, they really need a broader ITS framework, which exists in a number of more developed cities, but it is not uniform across the world. So what I'll speak mostly about now is ITS governance and how we can enable ITS from a governance perspective. And as I mentioned, there are thousands of ITS vendors and suppliers who are all competing for market share. And with that, there also comes many different business models. And generally, the bigger players who own a much wider catalog of solutions have a tendency to lock in cities to their solutions. This is known as vendor lock-in. And they do this obviously to maximize profit. That's just business after all. But this does bring up an important notion of open versus closed systems. So closed systems are basically systems that are not interoperable, where a company that develops a wide range of ITS solutions are not able to communicate with external solutions. And when a government uses these, it lowers the potential for innovation, efficiency, and flexibility. So it's great for the ITS vendor, but it's not great for the government entity. And on the other hand, you have other vendors and suppliers who develop open ITS solutions. And these are solutions that are able to communicate, interoperate, and share data with one another. And this increases the potential for innovation, efficiency, and flexibility. And it also future-proofs many elements of becoming more technologically advanced for a city. And this is why the first step to deploying ITS solutions in a city is first to actually develop an ITS framework, and preferably an open ITS framework. And the ITS framework is essentially a structure for effectively governing and maximizing the potential of ITS, because countries and cities, they need a common vision, common set of standards, architectures, and I'll focus on architectures in the next couple of slides, as well as policies and governance. And within an open ITS framework, this should be designed to enable data sharing capabilities, system integration, and interoperability across all ITS systems and subsystems, with the fundamental purpose of avoiding things like vendor lock-in, a duplication of efforts, and instead enabling greater efficiency, flexibility, and innovation. And if your city doesn't have any such framework, a very good place to start is with the Open Group Architecture Framework. So while we're talking about architectures, the architecture is within the framework, and this is a set of high-level views that enable plans to be made for integrating ITS applications and services, and it normally covers other technical aspects, plus the related organizational, legal, and business issues. And I'll give you an example so it's a little more clear, but if your city doesn't have an ITS framework in place, you can draw a lot of inspiration from pre-existing standards. Actually, it's very advisable to draw from existing standards, and you can take inspiration, for example, from Europe. In Europe, we have the Framework Architecture Made for Europe, which is the acronym. And this is a framework created to provide a minimum stable framework necessary for the deployment of integrated and interoperable ITS. Similarly, the US DOT has developed ArcIT, and both have very useful websites that that you can sort of pick and choose different elements from and build your framework in a relatively easy fashion. And I mentioned briefly the Togaf framework, and this is an example of the architecture, and I can give you an actual example of what that could look like. So you have different hierarchies going increasingly into further technological detail. So at the top, you'll have your business architecture, which should align with your transport authority business entities, like your bus agency, rail agency, road agency, assuming you have such a structure in place. Not these metropolitan transport executives are not found everywhere, which is why, as part of our project in Asia, we're also looking to set up authorities that sort of house all the different transport functions in the city. So that's layer one. Then you go down one layer to the data architecture, and this is information on the service domains. And here you can see we have emergency services, public transport, disaster response management. And for each of these, there is a host of ITS solutions, so we can organize them accordingly. And then we can go deeper. You have your data architecture level 2. That's just more descriptive of level 1. And then you go into your application architecture. So here you have your ITS service name in line with the topic of the presentation or the session. Say we're interested in transport fleet management. So you'll have that there. When you click on it, it takes you to a further layer. And this is the application architecture service definition. So you have a definition, and then the tool you wish to use, you can then also include within this wider architecture. And this is the final view, which is the technology architecture. And this shows you the component blocks that are required to deliver the service. And I won't go into detail and exactly what all of these mean, but essentially it shows you all the different blocks. So here you have your transit management center, you have your transit vehicle onboard equipment, your operator, and all the communication links between these subsystems that are required to ensure that it's an open system. And very lastly, how can you enable, and what are the starting steps to make open ITS frameworks? Well, first you start with an assessment of the existing ITS in your city or your region, and you review that, you document it. You also meet with clients, conduct stakeholder interviews, review international and regional best practice, you review the existing policies. And then the next step is to develop your strategy and your architecture, and also a catalog of all the ITS that you would like to have. And you put a target date as to when you want to have this. So this could be up to 2030, excuse me. And next step is to put this on a roadmap. So when exactly you hope to deploy specific ITS solutions, and at what scale and what level of maturity. And then the final step is the governance and communication. Obviously, these are often enterprise level projects that affect all the different agencies within an authority. So you need to have effective structures in place to monitor your KPIs, your auditing procedures, to ensure that there's a smooth deployment and adherence to this framework across the entire authority. And for that, you do need to develop a communication or supporting communication strategy to train and educate both internally and externally. So I do hope that was useful. That was a very quick overview. If you have any questions whatsoever, I will be staying around until the end to answer any questions you might have. So thanks very much. If you have any questions you wish to ask me offline, you can find me by email or on LinkedIn.